Charges have been filed against Austin Sigg in the tragic killing of young 10-year-old Jessica Ridgeway. Jessica Ridgeway was the child from the suburban Denver community who was abducted, and then her body was later found dismembered and in an open field about 9 miles away from her family home. This is one of the most disturbing and upsetting cases that we cover here at Wild About Trial. And as Austin Sigg's arraignment approaches, we are going to take a look at all the charges that have been filed against him and talk about what they mean.
So there have actually been 17 charges filed against Austin Sigg. And maybe we can separate ourselves from the sort of emotion of this case and how unbelievably tragic it is. And so let's break it down and get into the law a little bit too.
Okay,
so
law I can handle.
The 17 charges include 1 for premeditated murder, 3 for felony murder. There's also a second-degree kidnapping charge and a robbery charge. There's also 3 charges stemming from a separate incident, which is for attempted murder and attempted kidnapping of a young 22-year-old jogger that he's also been linked to through DNA evidence. So maybe, Kelly, you can tell people the difference between murder and felony murder. He has 1 charge for premeditated murder and 3 charges for felony murder. How could he have 4 different murder charges?
The difference between murder and felony murder isn't just confusing for the layperson. This is something that's confusing for lawyers and law students as well. It doesn't make intuitive sense, right? How is there 1 victim and yet somehow there are 4 murder charges? But what happens is so we have the 1 murder charge, the 1 straight up premeditated murder, which the prosecution feels that they can prove. And then there were also 3 other crimes that the prosecution is alleging that Sigg committed while he was committing the murder. So 3 things that happened at about the same time that are all part of the same chain of events. Does that make sense? These 3 crimes are all serious, violent felony crimes. They are a kidnapping, a robbery, and a rape. When you have 3 violent felony crimes that happen while you are committing a murder or that are attendant to the commission of the murder, those 3 crimes can be charged as something called felony murder. It's basically felonies that are committed in pursuit of the murder. The classic law school example of this is someone who is robbing a liquor store and who maybe doesn't mean to kill the cashier, but the gun fires in the middle of the robbery, and then he's charged with felony murder because he was committing a robbery and a murder also occurred. And the way that this is used in the criminal law is that when there are cases where perhaps the defendant didn't have the state of mind that he wanted to kill someone, he hadn't quite premeditated the murder, but he was doing these terrible violent felony acts that were violent enough and dangerous enough that a murder was likely to happen, then you get these felony murder charges. So that's how a crime can go from something like a rape and rise to the level of felony murder if someone dies during the commission of the rape. Does that make sense, Ryan?
So if there's like a robbery and there's a getaway driver and they're fleeing from the scene and somebody dies in a car accident relating to this escape, there's a death that happens that is related to and is a part of the felony of robbery that is happening here. Because there's a death that results from the commission of that felony, they can be charged with felony murder.
Right. That's exactly correct. That's a perfect example. And this all goes back to this greater idea that in order to prove the crime of murder, the prosecution has to show that there was premeditation and malice aforethought. Sometimes that isn't necessarily there, but you can show that someone was in the middle of committing a felony crime that was so dangerous and where the risk of life was so high, and they were playing so fast and loose with another human being's life, and that person did in fact die, that they're basically guilty of murder no matter what. So that is how we get to 4 different murder counts with one victim. We have the actual murder, and then we have felony murder rape, felony murder kidnapping, and felony murder robbery.
So when you see 4 murder charges and only 1 victim, what we're saying here is that the prosecution has 4 different ways to pursue a murder charge against this one defendant. So in order to convict Sigg of murder, they don't necessarily have to get him of premeditation and having the state of mind that he wants to kill this person, although the facts of this case are pretty awful. But there's also 3 other approaches you can go with. You have to prove that he committed these other felonies. If they can convict him of these other felonies, the robbery or the kidnapping, then because there's a death that resulted from them, then they can get him on murder as well. So it just it's an extra prong that the prosecution has to loop in this murder charge. And it makes sense as a deterrent when loss of life is involved. It's best to have some sort of charge to justify someone's loss of life.
I mean, that's absolutely right. It has to do with, first, as you say, giving the prosecution more theories to get a murder conviction. And second of all, it really goes back to doing justice. If someone is committing these terrible, terrible crimes and someone dies because of that, well, maybe that person's not a murderer, but they killed someone. Through their wanton actions, they killed someone. So that's where this felony murder doctrine comes from. It is a little bit confusing. Please, if you have any questions about this, don't hesitate to post in the comments. We'll do our best to explain it. We can do a follow-up video. And do check us out on Wild About Trial for an even more thorough explanation of the felony murder concept and for all of the facts and unfortunately gory details in this terrible, terrible case.